Hello. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Martin. I'm Director of Product Management here at SmartBear. I'm joined by Parag.
And my name is Param Chopra. I'm one of the sales engineers here at the US team at SmartBear.
All right. So you know what we're going over today because it says so on your screen, Scaling Agile Development with BDD. For anybody who doesn't know, we should probably actually define BDD.
Sure.
That was my cue to hit the button for the next slide.
I see.
So I'm going to let you go. You got a better voice.
Right. So BDD, or behavior-driven development, is a collaborative approach to software development in which software is specified and designed by describing its behavior from an outside perspective in a shared language across pretty much everything in your organization. Now, all the users, all your personas, and every process they're involved with, and all the tools that they use as well. The idea is not only to collaborate, but collaborate in a way where everyone can really very easily be on the same page at all times.
Yeah, and to me, the reason we started with a definition, because one, we're not entirely sure if this audience knows what BDD is yet or not, so we're starting to set a baseline. But second, and kind of importantly, the way we approach BDD, the way we're going to be talking about it, is as both a process and a tool. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about it as a tool. You know, they'll talk Gherkin, or they talk about the technical implementation. But the value of BDD is limited if it's only just used as a tool.
Exactly.
It really needs to be part of a process. That's actually where the name comes from. Behavior-driven development. It doesn't say, Gherkin-like tool at the end of the day. So, all right, we did the definition thing. We should probably talk a little bit about why this keeps coming up for people. I'll take this one.
Sure.
I like this slide. The way software is built has changed. So we all kind of know this. We've been hearing about it for a decade. People have talked about the end of waterfall and everything's agile now. And I personally don't find the actual words agile particularly useful. It means too many things to too many people. And everybody has their own version of it. For the purposes of today, when we talk about scaling agile development, what we really mean is iterative processes over defined phases and handoffs. There's a lot of business speak in there, but basically, most people we're talking to are somewhere in the either switched over already to iterative processes, Scrum, Agile, continuous delivery, integration,
Sure.
testing, and continuous X, DevOps, those kinds of rapid delivery of value with a lot of testing and coordination between dev, test, and ops, versus the old school, let's build it in a couple phases. We'll have somebody write all the requirements, then build it, then somebody else will go test it,
Right.
et cetera. So that's really what we mean when we say agile. So far, we're 5 minutes in. All we've done is define the words in our title, but
That's one way to start.
I guess. But it's important because in our industry, things mean a lot of different things.
Right.
To different
And I
people.
think semantic stuff can trip up people. I think something Jeff definitely brought up as well is also something we'll hit on in this presentation is that, again, BDD is very process driven, right? What tool you use, how you decide to implement that is really up to you. And while there's some tools out there that can definitely aid you in that process, similar to how Jeff is trying to, define how we talk about agile versus traditional development, BDD is really about that process. We don't want to tie it down to something limited necessarily.
Right. So end of the day, we talked to a lot of people trying to make this transformation or just thinking about beginning to make this transformation. So we just went ahead and listed a few of the big obstacles they actually end up kind of going through. Well, we were supposed to go through all those little pieces. We
I
can
see.
just go fast, so we're good.
All right. And we should probably go here, right?
Perfect.
All right.
All right. So what's the reason people are trying to change? I'm going to let you take that one.
So, what we see with more siloed departments is that there's a couple of issues that can definitely bog down, I think, not only the time it takes to release version of your application, but also time to fix bugs, time to send updates and mission critical updates for a certain customer. Usually we see this where there's a lot of manual information handoff. Information isn't handed off correctly, so people can definitely not be aligned in their goals. And then from there, if, this is definitely something that BDD touches upon as well, but if your developer and tester have a different idea of how the application should work than your business analyst or PO, and perhaps your customer has another different idea, and your whole team isn't aligned, you're not going to build a product that, or you're going to spend all this time building a product that might not be exactly what your customers want. Whereas if you work iteratively, right, it's more easier to quickly put something out there, get that feedback, and build something more closely related to the behavior your users want, right, in your application. Because at the end of the day, they have to use it.
Right. So this is why people go towards Agile, et cetera. But there's obstacles that come up.
Right.
And this is where BDD starts kind of fitting in to remove a few of these obstacles in Agile. Actually, somebody just put into the question, how do you implement those modern techniques we just talked about, the iterative stuff, when everything is completely separate departments? Well, sure, a traditional Scrum type guy would say, break all the departments down and put everybody together in a single Scrum team and co-locate them and have daily stand-ups. I'm going to take a stab in the dark here that Chahan, when you asked that question, you don't have the power to go break down those different departments and reform your entire organization and how you develop.
It's probably not realistic.
It's not realistic. Would that be the ideal thing? Sure. Is it going to happen? Probably not for many people. So what you end up with is obstacles,
right,
actually facing your Agile deployment. BDD will come in a second, but let's focus on the obstacles for a minute.
As I was saying, so some of these obstacles would be that communication collaboration piece, right? So the benefits of being more modern is to, kind of avoid some of those process bottlenecks. I said earlier that, people working separately, it's hard to align their actual values. So that's definitely a certain challenge as well, more old school development. Then lastly, and where BDD will come in as well, is that tool chain. And while BDD is not tied to a certain tool set, the idea is that everyone's using the same set of tools or processes, right? But in solid departments, your QA team might be using a completely different set of tools than maybe your developers and test team, or so on and so forth.
I mean, if you're trying to be more agile or iterative, just to kind of stick to the same language here,
right?
At the end of the day, if you can't break down those silos, these are the problems you have. You can't align your internal stakeholders, right? Because people aren't on the same page. They're not even on the same team. They're not incentivized the same way. Your tools, every team has its own tools, its own environments, its own way of doing things. And then the handoffs, the way those people communicate together, create process bottlenecks, things that slow you the heck down. Can I say heck? FCC kind of like
I think you can.
Okay. So those process bottlenecks, right? This is true. These challenges hold true basically no matter what your organizational structure is. I don't care if you're on a Scrum team and everybody's, happy and you're all going out for beers every night and everybody's working great together, or if you have complete silos and, you have two different silos that don't talk to each other because they hate each other's guts. So these challenges actually arise no matter what.
Right. So
how do you fix it? Well, we just put it up on the screen. You need a holistic approach. You need something that actually aligns those three things. You need to approach it from a bigger perspective on the process, how you're going to align all the people, and then what tools that you guys can use to share. And that's where we used, I can't remember what we say in the definition, ubiquitous language or common language. Common language. That common language is actually really important. So at this point, we're going to take a quick stop for a second and do a poll. It really helps us to get some feedback from people so we know what's going on. So we're going to throw that poll up. It's great. And is your organization currently trying to move from, and we stuck to the same words, defined phase approach to an iterative process? And we'll give everybody a second there. It looks like we got a bunch of results coming in.
So far, it seems that majority of you definitely do want to move from a defined phase to an iterative process.
I was expecting this, right? It seems like everybody we talk to is trying to move from one to the other and facing these obstacles.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the next part of this presentation now is, we've talked about, what BDD is, perhaps why we want to do it, right? In terms of avoiding some of these challenges that are listed on the screen. So
We'll actually share the results. We have a whole new polling thing.
Right.
We're all excited about this. Sorry. So there we go. We got a good 73% of you saying you guys were trying to move over.
Right. So now we want to answer a question, right? You want to move over. We can kind of see what BDD can do for us at a high level. We can see why we want to use it in terms of the benefits versus the challenges associated with more old school type development. So how do we go about doing this? Well, as Jeff's mentioned, right, we want to use, at least at a start, right, a common language, common process, so that not only is everyone aligned from the start, but everyone can understand literally what exactly is happening from a technical and business level. So one way we can define a common language is through a language that you probably have heard of before. If you've heard of BDD, and that is using Gherkin. So
this is the heart of BDD, right? That common language, that common structure that everything else flows through. For some reason, the industry settled on the term ubiquitous language. It's got a lot of syllables, but what it is common. Everybody's speaking the same language. And
you certainly don't need to use what we'll go through now, Gherkin, to make that the common language, right? Gherkin simply was something that was, implemented almost in an academic sense to say, okay, everyone can work in this manner. It follows certain, logical paradigms, so on and so forth. Ultimately, it can be whatever shared language that you guys want for your team, whether it's even more high level or perhaps lower level as well.
Right. And we're going to show this in actual action, in context, in an actual process in a minute. But we got to set all these baselines correctly for everybody.
Right.
So what the heck is Gherkin besides a pickle, which I still think is just hilarious that it's called Gherkin?
Definitely I'd say that the key, other than being that common language, the key phrases in Gherkin are these 3 words you see here in the blue: given, when, and then. The idea is that you want to first set the context, any requirement or scenario you're working with, right? You want to set the context scenario. You want to perhaps set what happens in that scenario and then a result, right? And usually this is what people are trying to test. Well, they're testing piece of UI, backend functionality, UX process, so on and so forth. You can find it in these kind of scenario or requirement type things.
It's kind of funny because testers have been writing like this forever. Right. At the end of the day, a lot of people still use prerequisites, which is really your context. And then the definition of a test is actually there's an action and you have an expected outcome. When it fails, it's the actual outcome doesn't match the expected.
Right.
So testers have been writing like this. I'm just going to state that out loud because testers are just that much better than business and development. But
one way to plug that.
Sorry, just throwing that in. But what happens is if tests are written that way, because that's the definition of a test, why wouldn't you also want to write your requirements that way? Why wouldn't you want to develop against this kind of structure? So that's really where BDD came from. It actually started from something called test-driven development. And then some very smart people said, well, wait a minute, these aren't really tests anymore. These are behaviors. This is what I expect my application or my users to behave like.
Exactly.
So it's funny, all of this really comes out of testing and then it kind of spreads into that business development and to a degree ops. But we're not focusing on that. So hopefully that was clear. If it's not, please throw something in the chat. We can always clarify it here. I love that we just restated given, when, then with different words, but that context, action, outcome, it's actually really important.
Right. And again, I think the reason why I think Jeff brought up, hey, we're only making tests this way, why not develop the rest of our process in a similar manner? The benefit of doing that is that then everyone, again, is understanding exactly what needs to be built, tested, developed, so on and so forth, right? They're understanding that we're building for the behavior of this application and not what each, let's say, silo thinks the application should be.
And at the end of the day, it's also something that any human can kind of understand. This is how we talk, right? When I get into my car and I turn my key, the car starts. You don't need to know how the car works.
Exactly.
The behavior. So those pieces, we kind of threw an example in there that we're going to go through in a minute in an actual tool. But it makes sense. When I launch my web application and I enter my username and password and I hit submit, I should get to the front page. That's a requirement. It's a test. And it actually tells the developer very, very clearly what they should be developing against.
Right.
How do they know what they developed is the right thing? Does this happen?
Does it, does their code work in the exact same process that, let's say, the application should behave in? Because again, it's easy to build something where in service, it does the same thing, but if it does it differently, it might cause some problems for the customer, so on and so forth.
All right.
So,
where the people fit in, because we kind of covered some of the process here, believe it or not. But I wanted to talk for a second about these different, I'm going to call them roles. So, our buddy Chahan there actually said, you guys still have different silos. Great. Everybody, even if you don't have silos, even if you're great, you've kind of broken things down into Scrum, there's still these roles that people play. Sometimes it can be the same person, but they're playing 3 different roles. Make them sound like actors. So there are 3 main roles in all of this. The business guy, the person who's actually defining the requirements. What are we building? What are we trying to accomplish here? The benefit of putting things in that BDD scenario, that given, when, then statement for him, for that role, is actually very clear. 1, it's an easy way to write a requirement.
Right.
But 2, from the input from other people using the common language, they get nice, clear feedback. And it's usually example-based. The fact that it's the way people talk makes people lean in towards giving actual use cases, actual behaviors, not just this doesn't work, not just this requirement isn't clear enough, but they actually come back with something that's example heavy.
Right.
Development, you're closer to development. You talk on that one.
Right. And so development, specifically, their goal is to make that scenario work given on how the scenario is defined, as let's say defined by a business analyst or team. Where they fit in this process, though, but you could use Gherkin and then have your business analysts only build the requirements, pass them off to just your developers, and then pass off to the test. Then you're not really doing BDD, right? That collaborative aspect still has to be there. So really, I think to really try and achieve true BDD, your developers working with your business analysts, as Jeff said, and that kind of feedback-oriented loop. So maybe fine, the analyst might write it himself, but he sends it to the developer. They can go ahead and read it. They can imagine how they might develop the functions that go ahead and define these statements in their BDD scenario. Send it back to the business analyst, work on making sure that's properly fleshed out for them. So that when the scenario then is translated into an automated test, it's easy to maintain that and fix that. And again, make sure it's built in the way in which the business analyst, perhaps PO, intended. Right. Again, we can get that with that given, when, then structure.
By the way, I'll just head off some question or comment on this one. Yes, we understand that a lot of times testers are actually writing the automated tests.
Right.
It's in the name. We just put that underneath the development role. You're really acting like a developer there. You're writing code. You're developing code to test your other code.
Right. But
yes.
There's some overlap for sure.
Personally, one thing that I think is understated in most of the literature on BDD is actually the clarification it allows development to ask for from requirements. They can come back and actually say, I don't understand the context of this. Your given isn't clear enough. I don't understand what we're doing. Hopefully the action's clear. That's kind of an uncommon one to make unclear. But again, maybe that's the piece. It gives you basically one of 3 silos, right? The context, the action, or the outcome that you can then go and ask for clarification for, massively speeding up the cycle between development and, I'll just call them product or business.
And I think that context piece you bring up is huge because it's very easy to write requirements with no context saying, okay, it has to do this, but if you don't know when or why, then it might be tougher to build, right?
What's leading in, et cetera.
And then at some point, your developers, testers are under deadlines. They're going to build it at some point, and then you might not get exactly what you bargained for.
And the test part is actually kind of the easiest part of this. It's pretty easy to understand why testers like BDD.
Right.
Because basically you're given a test design from your business people, so you don't have to go rewrite it, which is great.
Your developers will go ahead and implement that test design in pretty much any kind of code format you'd like.
But one other big piece, and the reason it's a really good process fit, is it allows for really easy reporting from test. Again, it's one of those underappreciated values here. Scenario pass or fail is a lot cleaner then did we cover this requirement with enough different test cases, right? Very easy to report, extremely easy to trace because it doesn't even change. Right. The requirement is the test. So that makes the traceability, the linking between requirements and the development work and the tests so that you know what to fix when something fails,
right,
almost trivial. So it really does make testers' jobs a lot easier.
Right, because you have the choice of defining your BDD scenario to be very low level. So the number of cases it has to cover is few, or very high level, right? You have that power to define that. And then secondly, for testers, even if they're not very code heavy, they're not very technical, they can execute the BDD statements directly a lot of the times, right? So they can still go ahead and work with these complex automated test cases without having to actually dive into the nitty-gritty code. Again, you're allowing a larger range of users to touch this testing process.
All right. So we covered a good chunk of the process here. We're going to cover the rest of it actually in a tool.
Right.
Am I correct on that?
Yes,
yeah,
you
hey,
are.
showing it in action.
All right.
So before we do that, or actually while we're switching over, we're going to launch another poll where this is going to help us kind of tailor the second half here to our audience. Where are you guys in BDD? We really want to know, are you here to just learn about it? Are you beginning to try it? You're already using tools? Or are you already kind of fully involved in this and you're using the process in the same way we kind of just laid out, right? As an actual communication method. Whew, I love the results coming in.
We got some mixed bag here.
It matched what I expected, I got to say, because very few people are fully using the process and the tools all together.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people just starting to implement. Obviously, a lot of people here to learn, but people using tools, they're the ones I'm actually kind of most interested in. People who are using it as a tool, but not a process. Just personally, I find that one the hardest one to deal with because it involves convincing people above you that you have to change the process, not just use a specific tool.
Exactly.
Hopefully we'll give you some
ammo here.
Something here, right?
Right.
That's why we'll send out the deck and everything afterwards.
Right. Because again, it's really not about the tool set, but if you really set that process about a tool set beforehand, then the tool you pick will be, I think, it'll be easier to decide what tool to use and it'll have more value.
Right. So we didn't want to just go through this in PowerPoint. That's not all that interesting.
Yeah.
You get to listen to me talk too much.
And as you can tell, I've been struggling with these slide transitions, so not my forte.
Yeah, that's how it goes. But we did want to actually go and show this this happens to be our tool, but we're really trying to focus on the benefits of BDD, how this works, and how those transitions between people and roles actually happen in practice.
Right. So, and again, the idea is that no matter what interface or where you do this, the idea is to collaborate. So our tool, HipTest, is a web-based platform that does allow us to go ahead and collaborate across business units, not only develop these Gherkin statements in a very rapid fashion with its unique Gherkin editor, but also then to translate those statements into various different code formats. So we can really get a lot of value out of it.
But realistically, just before we scare people off, we're not trying to sell you a tool.
Yeah.
We're literally just trying to show the BDD, and we happen to have a great tool for it. So we're using our tool.
I mean, unless you guys really love that PowerPoint, do let us know. We can certainly go back to that in the future. So let's just go ahead and dive in to our test here. So we were talking about Gherkin, right? So maybe let's take a look at a Gherkin scenario here in this tool. Again, the idea of a tool like this is that you use it as a central place to collaborate. So ideally, your business analyst, your developer, your tester, your PO, or whoever necessary stakeholders are there are working together or iteratively in building out these scenarios, right? And
I've seen this done different ways. I mean, there's the old school, let's put a whiteboard up inside of a Scrum meeting.
Right.
Or heck, Word documents that people share. I've seen that too.
Right.
There's some big benefits to using a tool around that. But most of those benefits are really process-based, right? It gives you a centralized place to collaborate.
And, regarding this editor, right? So the centralized place is one thing, but regarding this editor, I think is what make this tool unique because, sure, you could write out your Gherkin statements, using a tool like Cucumber or SpecFlow. You could use Word documents, right? But you're writing out a lot of things that are hard to, let's say, compartmentalize and share out, and hard to, let's say, maintain over a long period of time. Because ultimately, those small components, unless you really take a lot of time to build them separately, it's harder than to, let's say, reuse them and build other test cases. But a tool like HipTest, we try to make it easy for users to reuse their work and not make them build, large, complex scenarios from scratch, let's say.
And you might notice here, we actually threw an and in this particular one. So we're getting a little more complex on the scenarios than just purely given, when, then.
Right.
Although, honestly, not that much more
It's not
complex.
that much more complex. Sorry, the and is just, you can throw an and anywhere. And ultimately, there are some academic conventions around given, when, then, how you try scenarios. But again, it's really all up to you, right? You don't have to use the terminology even in this order. It's just recommended given the nature of the language. So right now, our scenarios is such. Given I've launched the orders application, it's just some sample application we have here at the company, and I've logged in with a username tester and password test. When I add a new order for this customer, looks like we're parameterizing that with a variable, then I should see a new order for that customer name upon return to the list. It's a pretty simple, low-level BDD scenario, right? Testing that I'm adding an order successfully to this web-based orders application.
And you might notice on the left-hand side there's like a folder structure. So one good practice with any BDD stuff, no matter what tool you're using, is to structure this in some way. I've seen more than a few people with just giant lists of scenarios.
It's probably not going to help you out.
It's just harder it's really hard to process, actually.
Right.
End of the day, old school, everybody's used Windows, get folders, organize stuff. That's how you do your email, maybe. That's helpful. A lot of the cooler, newer tools allow you to do things like adding orders tag up there.
Right.
That's really just a different way of structuring things. But at the end of the day, the structure matters because you're going to end up trying to reuse these items.
Exactly. So, taking, again, collaboratively, of course, taking that time to define your structure, how you want to organize things, that's going to go a long way versus trying to leave that, at the last minute or things like that.
And I'll head off a question there because we always get asked every time we talk about folder structures or how you structure your frameworks or anything like that. At the end of the day, this structure is dependent on your application. There shouldn't be, I've read papers before and they're like, structure your folders, have all your, performance requirements in one folder and all of your security requirements in another folder. And thinking of things that way in like a one-size-fits-all manner is a bad idea. The whole point of BDD approaches is to have a common language for your application that you're building and testing. That language is carried through in the structure you put your scenarios in. Therefore, your structure should make inherent sense based on your application.
Exactly.
Right. So I like this example because, I don't know, we've all bought stuff, but, right. Adding orders, deleting orders. Those are things that I don't even need to know a single thing about what this application is doing, but I now understand that folder structure. Right.
Right.
That's the sign of a good structure, but it should be specific to your application.
Exactly. So for this one, our initial testing is just focusing on adding orders and deleting orders. So I named my folders and tags as such. So with this application, specifically with this this tool HipTest, one of the ways why we believe it's a good place to even if you're starting with BDD to kind of use it is because you're not working from scratch ever. For example, if I were to add to this statement, right, and I start typing in, you'll see I have all these suggestions here. So one thing this tool allows me to do is reuse other lines from other scenarios in the scenario I want to create. And ultimately, what this editor is very much like is it's like an IDE code editor almost, right? Think about it. In an IDE or in a Java class or C# class, you define all your objects beforehand, right? You give that structure. Then when you're writing out your code, right, with a little IntelliSense coding, it's easy to then quickly pull up that object path you want to reference, the function, so on and so forth. So think of this as a very similar kind of editor, but specifically for BDD statements. So it can show me some suggestions on, let's say, phrases starting with letter I. And in the future, it can perhaps show me suggestions based on how I've been incorporating phrases like it in other scenarios.
So a little bit on the process here.
Right.
Where does this, how do we decide what to put into this? Well, in an ideal world, maybe you're gone into like actual Scrum and you're all sitting down and
Right.
you're specking out your give me a different word.
Specifying.
We're specifying the actual steps in here collaboratively and all together. Look, that ideal world doesn't really happen very often.
Right.
Maybe very small teams and small companies, but for the most part, it's a bunch of people sitting down at their desk separately and not really going back and forth on this. So what ends up happening is you end up with people who are trying to use a common language, but are failing because they're still using that common language separately. For instance, where I just said specking and he just said specifying.
Right.
But you didn't know that was on purpose.
All right, Jeff, thinking ahead.
Right. And you end up with slightly different languages. Putting everything in one spot helps solve that problem.
Right.
Because even if you can't sit down and talk to the person all the time and you write it together, at least you're actually working on it together in one spot.
Right. And, speaking of concise language, it's not only important per scenario, but you will have scenarios that have common steps. Like I might use this step, launch an application, and in multiple other scenarios. I wouldn't want it written differently in each scenario, right? Again, that's going to cause some kind of ambiguity in what exactly my application should do. So not only is consistent business language important, but employing the sub-steps of your scenario consistently, if they're going to be used other places, is also a big importance for maintenance.
And I'll use the fancy terms, right? This is actually a form of a domain-specific language. For instance, we're calling all of these things orders.
Right.
Right. We're not saying cart. We're not saying, I don't know, some other word for order. Request.
I couldn't even think of it, right? We're so great in this word.
I know,
at this point.
And that's the point.
Right.
We're using a language. The tool helps, but the tool does not actually get you as far as you need to go. You need to actually, decide this common language.
Right. That being said, when you do decide that common language, it's easy to take advantage of that in a tool like this.
Right.
Even at the step level. So, we have 4 steps in a scenario. These steps can further be defined, let's say, in this little section here called action words. So, there's no right or wrong way in where you want to start, right? You can start defining scenarios, save certain steps that will be used other places as action words, or you can come right in here and just start defining and creating action words, meaning that these are phrases or things that, okay, my application is going to do these things.
And to me, it's a dictionary.
Right.
That's really what it boils down to is when I add a new order, what does that mean?
Right.
And now I have an actual definition of that word, that action, right? Add a new order. When I add a new order for a customer to the orders list is now a defined thing that everybody can use that has the exact same definition.
Exactly.
Now, we get fancier with action words in the tool because these really do link over to other items.
Right.
But at the highest level, that's the value. It's a shared dictionary.
Right.
And any good BDD process should have something like this. The same way you store functions in development.
Exactly.
Or, template test cases in testing, or your requirement templates.
It's fascinating, actually, because academically speaking, you're essentially applying coding practices, right, and organizational paradigms from that world into, business processes of your company and design element as well, right? So being modular is definitely a big focus of this. Then from there, these definitions, they can be reused, but you can have, let's say, multiple of the same word defined differently. Like I have my phrase, I've launched orders application, right? And I define it down here as such. But maybe I want to launch an orders application without opening a specific browser and clicking on a URL, right? Maybe my developer might not write the test code to reflect that. So if I want my developer or tester to, build this out in a specific way, I can add even more specifications down here. So we can be so again, it's all up to you and how specific or high level you want to be. But as long as you're consistent in your language, then I can take these smaller pieces, right? Like given I've launched the orders application and easily use it in every single scenario that requires that step.
So you got that common language going. So I think we've hammered that point home.
Right.
I hope.
Right.
So generally speaking here, we haven't really mentioned one of the other keywords, which is automation. We've mentioned it once.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big values of BDD is filling in these action words with as much automation as you can.
Exactly.
And we don't need to go over all the benefits of automation. I think it's well known at this point. It's faster. It's much more reliable in a lot of cases, depending on what you're trying to automate.
Right. And scalability as well.
Scalability, it's speed. You want to be able to run overnight tests, continuous testing overnight every time you do a build. There's all sorts of great values for automation. And it would be foolish to not include automation into these scenarios when you can. So there's some pieces here, but big picture, any BDD framework is really built with automation in mind. All of the technologies out there in the world, this is not specific to us. BDD is built to be able to fill in the scenarios with automation easily.
So something to take note now. Those of you who are new to BDD or might just started with it, you probably heard of some tools like,
Cucumber
or SpecFlow, something like that. Cucumber is the big one. Those are BDD tools because they allow you to write Gherkin and then immediately translate those into let's say, function definitions, right? And you can implement those as you'd like. But we said this at the beginning, right? BDD is not Gherkin specific. It's not tool specific. You can take scenarios not written in Gherkin text and just directly translate them to JUnit, right? Or something like that, right? You could even you could use the given when then scenarios here in a tool like KipTest, then directly implement it in Ruby without having to build an extra layer in Cucumber.
And this is important. It's actually why I find it interesting that so many people were basing things on tools rather than process, or they hadn't gotten to process yet.
Right.
Because your average application nowadays is not just a website. It's usually a complex thing. It's got backends, it's got front ends,
It's got an API.
It's got an API, it's got let's just say it's got a mobile app.
Component.
Things are complex nowadays.
Right.
They just are. You don't write everything in the same language. Your development teams might not even all use the same language.
Right.
Good BDD frameworks, the scenarios should be translatable into the tooling that is necessary for that scenario.
Right. That best fits that team.
Right. Your API guys, maybe they're not using RSpec because that's kind of a web development thing.
Right.
It'd be a little odd.
And I know, I know someone asked in the questions, hey, how do we move our siloed teams off? Well, the way you don't want to do that is to say, okay, everyone's got to use Cucumber now. Everyone's got to be aligned in this one. Because that, again, as Jeff said, might not work for each specific team's needs. So a good BDD tool or good framework is saying, I can take these abstracted scenarios and implement them right in the way that best suits my team. There shouldn't be a limitation on that. It's more about working collaboratively versus forcing them to work the same way. There's a difference in that.
So, there's a whole bunch of other pieces in here, and, this isn't meant to be a tool demo here.
Yeah,
so
it's not.
Jerry, sorry, we're actually done kind of going through a lot of that.
But let's go ahead and take a look at what that code could look like.
Right.
So what I'll do, just the last piece about this tool, which is nice, is that it does allow us to extend our BDD scenarios you define into any of these frameworks, which will be a growing list. But we'll go ahead and just go with JUnit today. So I think Java is pretty popular. And
this is for you developers and more technical testers out there. At the end of the day, you want to be able to take these scenarios and translate it into something you can put in your IDE.
Exactly.
Right? How do you actually end up using this as a developer to go fulfill those scenarios or to build automated tests against those scenarios?
Now, that being said, even for you less technical people, I think you're going to see the kind of correspondence between these scenarios and the structure your developers will get. So even if you're not, exactly privy to, what the code is doing, I think it's where it does it, how it's being used. I think that'll be pretty apparent through this example.
And we promise for you non-developers, there's only a few minutes of IDE stuff in here with code.
Right. So it's
don't get all scared.
All right. So those are here we go. All right. So let me just make this a little easier to read. Because usually smaller code looks scarier when I was in school, the smallest code looked really scary, but once you zoomed in, I'm like, oh, I can read that.
It's like fine print.
Yeah. It's like, oh, this is, when you make it the size of a children's book text, I think everything becomes easier.
So this, at the end of the day, this is that next piece, right? So we talked a little bit about the business piece. Even testing works in scenarios a lot of times.
Right.
But the more developer roles, they work in code. That's their language. They need a way to translate the common language
Exactly.
scenarios into their specific language code
Right.
in whatever the heck code they're writing.
Sure. So in this case, we're using Java, and what's happening is when you use a unit framework like JUnit or NUnit, things like that, usually these frameworks are in the form of classes, right? So then the classes can have a certain initialization method, the test methods, teardown method. This case, you can define with JUnit. We're not going to give you those initialization methods, but free to use them or not use them. What we will give you is the actual test definition and execution of that. So right now, remember we saw that Gherkin statement, right? Adding a new order, right? That's defined right here in this function, and we can see some of the steps, right? We can see our tag from our hip test tool. We can even see a nice description here as well. Then we see our 4 steps, right? I've launched this application, I've logged in, I've added new order, and I've deleted, or I should see new order upon return to the list.
And we're using our publisher service because we can hit a button and it does all this for us.
Right.
And that's, why wouldn't we do that?
Again, even developers don't want to write everything from scratch.
But that's the idea with BDD, is you're basically going to give this structure, the scenario structure,
right.
And then those actions, your whens, your checkpoints, which are thens,
right.
your outcomes, those get filled in by the developer using whatever they're automating with. I don't know, Selenium,
sure.
Commercial automation tools, we sell a bunch.
Yeah.
API layers, great. Go ahead.
Again, it's really up to you. But then, as Jeff said, right, to make that an easier process, how you define your scenarios will have a big impact on the code that will be implementing those scenarios. So, for example, with our tool, because we can break up each step into its own action word, right? I don't have to, let's say, throw my developer, okay, add a new order for me. Sure, this example is pretty simple. They can figure that out, but you might have a much larger use case that has multiple steps. It's always going to be easier for a developer or tester to develop something that does less than something that does more, right? You could have a function that logs into Facebook, adds a friend, deletes a friend, and logs out. That could be one long thing, but it might be harder to maintain that down the line, longer to build.
Right, it's just bad development practice.
Yeah, it's easier to build one function that just logs in, one that just adds a friend, one that just deletes a friend, one that just logs out. Similar to what we're doing here. Then I can just define each specific piece by itself. Not only is each specific piece quicker to define, right? It's literally shorter, does one thing. It's quicker to maintain and debug as well, as it does one thing.
And the nice part of this is to go back to that collaboration kind of thing. Basically, what it's forcing is forcing people like me, who's in product, to write in a way that gives the developers those pieces so they don't have to go through that extra step of translating it
and trying to figure out exactly what Jeff wants.
And which, good luck. So then you should, I have like napkin drawings. Like, here's a requirement.
Right.
So the other part of this, and just to kind of wrap up, because we want to leave a little bit of time for questions, is when all this runs, or when you go and perform the test manually, because a lot of testing is still done manually,
right.
Always will be, the results are now in this format, right? With small pieces defined, individual actions and results, mapping to a scenario that actually dictates a, pass or fail based on the actual behavior you want to have happen,
exactly.
Rather than an artificial test case built by a tester against a behavior somebody else
wrote.
And
the key is that how, right? Like, remember how we were speaking about when I launched my orders application, I could do it multiple different ways. And then when I defined that action word right in the tool, I can see that the definition comes back as comments. So our tool helped make that a little quicker, but regardless, you can do it with an open source tool as well. The idea is that, again, I'm working collaboratively. I'm specifying the exact specific actions I want my developer to interact with. I don't want to just run a driver, launch the browser and a URL immediately. I want them to specifically, let's say, go to File Explorer, click on the browser, click on the URL, right? So I have the power to, again, specify and make it easier, right? You guys want to write code quicker? It's always easier to give more explicit instructions.
All right. So we're probably scaring people with all the code, but but I do want to answer one question that came in already. And by the way, guys, just throw questions at us. Now's a great time. We're wrapping up here.
So we'll answer the technical question first, because people, the fear goes.
You say
away quickly.
we. I'm going to say you.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll answer it. So this approach you're asking, are only void functions allowed? So usually with open source BDD frameworks in our tool, when you publish functions, it's going to come out as a public void. The reason is more to do with the unit framework we're using. So not all frameworks will have this this format. Usually unit frameworks use public void methods. They don't return anything because it's like it's just a routine. It's just an action. You can certainly go ahead and edit this and make it do whatever you want it to do, right? Think of it as a means to a start. It's just a framework.
It's a starting point.
If you want to go ahead and make some of these functions return something, if you want to change the way this framework behaves, you're more than welcome to. But right now, this is just exactly what a standard JUnit project would look like. The difference is that my BDD tool helped me create this framework structure versus building from scratch. Quite welcome.
I love it when it goes back and forth a little bit.
It's nice.
We're going to have to try unmuting everybody at one of these and just see what happens. I'm going to bet chaos.
Yeah, I hope I'm not there for that.
Yeah.
All right, but please, while we have some time left, do feel free to ask any questions, about what we've spoken about in the slides. Maybe about the tool we showed very briefly, about how you want to implement BDD, anything SmartBear is doing, feel free to ask at this point in time.
A little bit of quiet audience today, I think. Happens.
It's middle of the week, it's
middle of the week and early for us at least. Well, 9 in the morning to 10 in the morning.
I got here early, I got here earlier than I wanted to.
So, okay, somebody did ask a question here. Yeah, actually, HipTest, you can go hiptest.com and go use it.
Yeah, it's browser super easy to sign up for. It comes with its own samples as well. HipTest documentation's pretty killer as well. Great team.
Here's a good one. Sorry, we have to parse through the ones and make sure that something is applicable to everybody. Can we use BDD tools like Cucumber to automate regression test cases? Yeah, regression test cases really in a BDD world, what they become is your most common scenarios.
And really like almost a form of like living documentation. This is like how the tool should have been working, should be working.
Right. And so the regression test cases really become a core set of scenarios that you want to make sure always pass.
Mm-hmm.
And the selection of those might be a little different than you might be used to in a purely, let's just say, automation framework traditional manner. Because what you end up with is a little bit of prioritization based on user behavior, right? The whole point of this is to follow behaviors.
Exactly.
So in our example, something like adding something to your cart, I really hope that's part of a regression test case for an e-commerce application, let's say, right? That should be, it's a key workflow. But it becomes more key workflows, then let's automate everything we possibly can.
I think another reason it's actually useful is because, and you'll see this with BDD philosophy, you want to try and define your scenarios at as much, not too high of a level, obviously, but it's not useful if you're just saying, okay, given I click on this and I do that. But it's very low level. You're just adding an unnecessary layer of abstraction in your whole process. The idea is to help speed up things. So in the case of regression, you're defining your BDD scenarios in a higher level, more business level language. It might be clear to you, okay, I have this general high-level scenario. What are all the ways in which I can go ahead and fulfill this scenario, right? It's going to give you a standard of saying, I need to write all these regression tests to cover all the corner cases to the specific scenario. Versus without BDD, okay, well, it works. I tested it, right? But you didn't test all the ways in which you could, let's say, run.
So we got a couple product-specific questions. We'll park those. We'll reach out separately.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody asked, what about we had a new product launch recently, test left. How does that fit in? It's a way of actually fulfilling some of these functions.
Right.
But that's something we can talk about at some other point.
So to Jeff's point, I could have used test left and, thrown in my code right there to launch my application.
Right. It's it's a way of writing the code for these types of things.
Right.
Or other code. Automated test. So, maybe with that said, we'll wrap it up. We'll certainly reach out to anybody else. But, Colin, I think you had a question about Tech Partner Program. We'll reach out for a little bit more context there. But some of the other specific questions, we'll reach out to you guys directly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for attending, everybody. We hope that this session was helpful for you guys. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you want more information about this, if you have any suggestions about what content you want to see from us, go to your customer success manager, right? Go to your account rep. You can definitely get in touch with the right parties to make sure your voice is heard.
And then somebody asked about when and where will the recording be available? I'm horrible at this. I have no idea what you're saying. All right, I'm told Friday. They're trying to mouth it, and I can't lip read. All right. So thank you, everybody. We'll make sure we get this out to you guys on Friday.
All right.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye, everybody. you.